Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. With the transfer portal largely wrapping up in the spring window, just wanted to get on and take a quick look at what Nebraska kind of did overall in both the winter and spring portal windows, both what they were able to do in terms of retaining guys, what they were able to do to add some guys, make their team a little bit better, and try to grade this out and get a sense of where Nebraska kind of stands heading into this 2023 season. I think obviously most people would think, given that Nebraska really didn't lose a ton of guys to the portal and added some guys in some spots they certainly needed some guys, I think overall they did a really, really good job. So just going to grade that out, talk a little bit about what they did and review what they maybe didn't do, places they could have added a little bit more. But before we get too deep into the video, just wanted to thank all the Nebraska fans. Obviously, you guys have been super supportive really since day one for us, and it really does mean the world. So again, if you enjoy the content, please consider interacting, doing all the liking, subscribing, commenting, all those stuff. We really do love it. We love hearing from Nebraska fans, seeing where they're at, what their kind of outlook into the season is, where they're at in terms of where they think this program's going. And without further ado, getting into what Nebraska really did well, I think the obvious part is they were able to retain that roster, and more importantly, retain those young guys they were bringing in Matt Rule's classes. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, if Matt Rule is going to work out at Nebraska, it's going to be 100% about him being able to develop guys at a really high level and keep them in the program. And with the new era, with the NIL, with the transfer portal, all that sort of things, I think some people kind of think that developmental model is dead a little bit, and I couldn't disagree with that more. I think you're starting to hear some coaches start to push back, frankly, a little bit with this idea that every year we're going to cycle new guys in, move guys out, kind of do it the way Colorado, Ole Miss, some of these portal-heavy teams have been doing it, and you're starting to hear LSU, Michigan, obviously Nebraska being one of the headliners, teams that kind of say, like, look, it's going to be about getting guys into the high school classes, developing them up, and adding portal spots where you need, but it's 100% going to be about building around those high school classes. And that's kind of the first win I think Nebraska had this offseason is they just didn't lose a ton of those younger guys, especially in those offensive lines, some of those linebackers, guys who, again, have a lot of potential, but aren't going to get a shot to play a ton this year, just given what you have coming back. So being able to keep those type of guys, again, looking at those positions, they're really strong. Defensive or offensive line, I should say, linebacker room, secondary room, being able to keep guys like Ethan Nation and some of those offensive linemen, those guys who you're kind of building around in the future, I think it's huge. And I think, again, if Matt Rule is going to do this right and it's going to work for him at Nebraska like it's worked for him everywhere else, I think that's going to be a crucial part to see him be able to keep that roster together really effectively. I think that's the most important thing Nebraska did at the end of the day in the transfer portal. And going on to maybe some of the more exciting things that they did, some of the new pieces they bring in, I think the big part is bringing in high-end skill. I think you look at Jamal Banks, that's a huge get. Everyone I think who watched Nebraska knew, yes, the quarterback play was a bit of an issue at times, but they also needed some wide receivers who are a little bit more dependable. And I think, frankly, you like where you're at with bringing up some of those younger guys, obviously. So you didn't want to see them lose that type of guy. So you think the Malachi Coleman's, Jalen Lloyd, obviously having a big spring, Doss, like those type of guys, you wanted them to stay in the program. Nebraska did a really good job keeping those guys, but to bring in a guy like Jamal Banks, that true wide receiver number one for what I kind of want in a wide receiver, big, physical, the ability to get open and create separation. And then bringing a guy in Isaiah Nair who not proven like Jamal Banks is yet, but has some real potential if he can just stay healthy, and has kind of got squeezed out a little bit at Texas by, again, what appears to be one of the more talented wide receiver rooms in the country heading into this 2024 season. But a guy who's got a lot of talent and I think can add some things. I think you saw some moments in the spring game that made you think like, yeah, this is something we were missing, that ability to create big plays, especially after the catch and be able to run and again, get over the top. So his athleticism, his upside, I think it's huge. Again, not the proven production of Jamal Banks, who they were able to bring in, who I think immediately steps in and becomes wide out one, but still adding some of that upside potential that you really want to start building around as you usher in the Dylan Raiola era, because that's going to be huge for him to both get off to a hot start and for Nebraska to be able to put some more points on the board and be a more competitive team on a national level. And the final thing I kind of want to look at is what they were able to do in terms of getting guys who really fit almost exactly what I think Matt Rule wants to do. You think of a guy like Bly Hill, developmental piece, has a ton of talent, a lot of upside, but a guy you certainly are going to need to work around a little bit, or not work around, but like be able to develop up through your program. And a guy who, again, you look at what Matt Rule's been able to do with guys who are maybe overlooked to an extent, but have that talent, have that athletic profile you're looking for. Matt Rule's done a really good job in his coaching career of bringing those guys along. So you bring in a guy like Bly Hill. I think another one you can look at is a Stephon Thompson, who really fits what Tony White wants to do, adds a lot of that versatility that Tony White looks for in his linebackers when you want to see them be able to rush the passer a little bit, play in space, play in coverage, and take blocks on. Again, you look at what Stephon Thompson's been able to do in his college career, especially starting out playing for Tony White in Syracuse. He is that kind of guy. He is that type of linebacker they're looking for. That was another spot, losing some of those seniors you were going to lose. I think he wanted to add a little bit more depth and maybe a couple more guys who can play the way I think Tony White wants his guys to play, be able to play the way Javin Wright, I should say, plays the game, where he can do a little bit of both. You can put him on the line. He can play pretty effectively there. You can obviously put him in space. And once they found that kind of game out about him, I think his season really took off. So I think you have him coming in. You obviously have guys like John Bullock, Bayer still in the system, still in the pipeline, adding some of that depth. But to bring in a guy like Stephon Thompson, who, again, has that versatility that I think Tony White's very much looking for, I think is huge. And then obviously one more guy in Micah Mazakua, who, if you kind of look at his game, I mean, big, physical, nasty player that is kind of what Nebraska is trying to build in their offensive line room, that type of culture where they can run the ball and be more physical than they were under Scott Frost. Because, again, you can kind of look at if Nebraska is going to be a really good program, I think that's a school that should be able to recruit offensive linemen really, really well, like they did back in the 90s and the 80s, and those times when they were bigger, physical, they just could out-muscle teams out a little bit. I think Nebraska needs to get back to that a little bit. I think you're starting to see them recruit that offensive line position the way I think you kind of want Nebraska offensive lines to look in the future. But you bring a guy like Mazakua in, who, again, plays the way I think Matt Rule wants his guys playing. I think it's huge because, again, you love what you're doing in terms of developing young guys. I was really impressed in the spring with what you saw with some of those second and first year guys in the Nebraska offensive line. So you're seeing the development piece already come together. But I think you did want to maybe add one more guy, especially as the seasons wear on and you got to deal with some injuries. I think that was a really important get. And a guy who, again, I think fits exactly what Nebraska wants to do. So now that we've gotten to some of the positives and some of the wins I think Nebraska had, just wanted to talk on a couple of misses or possible places where I think Nebraska could have done a little bit more. And I think the first one's obvious to me. I think you would really like to add one more kind of proven quarterback. And this is where it gets tough because, frankly, when you have a guy like Dylan Raiola coming in, most quarterbacks look at that and say, this isn't going to be an easy place for me to play. And I think, frankly, a lot of transfer quarterbacks, that's typically what they're kind of looking for. I mean, Kyle McCord obviously wasn't guaranteed a spot back in Ohio State as the starting quarterback, and again, probably wanted to move on to a place where felt a little bit more comfortable about where he was going to be able to play. But I think you look, it would have been nice, I think, for Nebraska to add a guy like Jordan McLeod, AJ Swan, Brendan Sorsby, some of those young, like older, more veteran quarterbacks who, again, aren't lighting the world on fire. I don't think Nebraska was ever going to be in a position to grab that type of guy just because you have Dylan Raiola coming in, and it's really, really hard to convince some of those really high-end guys of that transfer portal quarterback room to kind of come to Nebraska, especially when you have that young guy coming. So I think you got to take it with a grain of salt, but I do think you would have liked to see one quarterback who is a little bit more proven because, frankly, I think you look at the Nebraska offense or the quarterback room in general, you really like Danny Kaelin. You obviously love Dylan Raiola. He is the future and probably the present, frankly, as well. But I think there's a case to be made. You would have wanted that floor to be a little bit higher. And if you have a guy like Jordan McLeod and AJ Swan, Brendan Sorsby, those type of guys, or one of those type of guys, I think you kind of add a little bit more competition. You add a little bit more veteran feel and presence that I think you would have liked, especially given how some of the quarterbacks played last year for Nebraska. So again, take it with a grain of salt. I don't think it was ever going to be an easy task. Matt Rule certainly isn't going to do some free agency quarterback deal. He made that very clear, and I don't blame him. I don't think most coaches of programs that are going to build sustainable success are going to engage in that type of thing. But it would have been nice, I think, to have one veteran quarterback who you can kind of believe in a little bit more than maybe some of the veterans that are on the roster at this point. So again, that's probably one place I look at and say, maybe could have done a little bit more. And then the second place is maybe just a little bit more secondary depth, I think. And again, go kind of on that similar theme. When you're Nebraska and you're not losing a ton of guys, it's very, very hard to add those guys who think they deserve to be playing immediately when they step on the campus and guys who are kind of looking for that in the portal. And frankly, that is a fair amount of the transfer portal at the end of the day. So you kind of look, another brutally difficult place to play is in that Nebraska secondary because you're really, really loaded. I mean, you look at what they have coming back in their transfer portal, obviously guys like Tommy Hill and Malcolm Hartzog and Deshaun Singleton, Isaac Gifford, go even to Marcus Buford, obviously. You're really, really loaded with talent in that room, and especially at that top line. But I think when you look at the depth, you probably could have some reasonable questions, especially given what we saw in the spring game and where you saw some moments where it was a little bit concerning about what's going to come after. And again, if you keep that front line healthy, you don't have any doubts. That's a really, really good top line secondary. But I think looking at maybe some of those spring games, looking at how young they're going to be behind that group, I think it would have been probably nice to add a couple of guys into that room who are a little bit more proven, a little bit more experienced, and can add some depth into that room that, again, always going to be hard because depth is frankly hard to add in the portal because a lot of guys want to go try to get a place where they can start. But again, that's probably the one other place aside from maybe that veteran quarterback that I look at and say Nebraska maybe could have done a little bit more. But at the end of the day, it's hard to say this was in any sense not a really, really positive offseason for the Huskers. Again, the big thing was you needed guys in that skill position groups with a lot more high-end talent. You did that. You add Dante Dowdle, you add Jamal Banks, you add a guy with a lot of explosive potential in Isaiah Nair. So I think that you mostly succeeded in terms of what you really had to address. Again, there were some luxuries that they maybe could have added in terms of keeping a little bit more depth going in some of those rooms, secondary quarterback possibly. But at the end of the day, I think Nebraska certainly did what they needed to do. And the big part is they retained their players. They retained their young guys. They're going to be able to build and develop those classes. And frankly, as I'm kind of sitting here talking about it, that is probably going to be where Nebraska gets their depth from. So again, as I'm sitting here, I don't know their names. We don't obviously necessarily know who they're going to be. But those guys from those younger classes, those true sophomores, those redshirt freshmen, those type of guys, I think, again, if you believe in what Matt Rule is about and what he is as a developer of talent, you can probably feel comfortable you'll get pretty solid play out of those young guys, and they'll be the ones serving as the depth. So I could be up here saying, oh, look, they're not very deep in the secondary just because they don't have a ton of proven guys. I'm sure Matt Rule takes one look at me and says, look, you just don't know. You're maybe not at every practice being able to scout these young guys, but they can play, and I believe in them, and that's how I'm going to do this. I'm not going to chase young guys out to add depth and for the short term. About the long-term health, it's going to be about building through the high school classes, keeping guys in the program, and developing them. So, again, I kind of look at this. I think Nebraska did about as good a job as anybody. Obviously, didn't have a ton of room to add a ton of guys given their scholarship limits, but I think they did a really, really nice job. I think they added guys who are good fits, added in the positions they needed, as I mentioned, with the high-end skill, and added a couple of guys who are, again, bring a veteran presence to some of those rooms, that offensive line room, wide receiver, obviously. So I'll give Nebraska an A. I really can't quibble with much. Again, if they maybe added a little bit more depth and got that quarterback, I maybe pushed that up to an A+, but I mean, I'm splitting hairs there, I think, looking at what Nebraska did, because, again, I think I'm grading this to an extent, or to a large extent, on the fact that I truly believe the Matt Rule system, the Michigan system, the LSU system, even those systems, that it's not going to be about portal guys. It's going to be about high school and developing. I think that's going to be a much more long-term, healthy, sustainable culture to build in your football program that, again, makes you competitive year after year. Not like you go one year, try to load up, take your shot, and then hope you don't fall off a cliff. So I think the way Nebraska's doing this and Matt Rule's doing it, I think is the right way. So I'll give them that type of grade. I think that's what they deserve. But again, would love to hear what the Nebraska fans think. I kind of look, especially with more of a quiet spring portal window. I'd be interested to know if like some Nebraska fans have some issues or think there were things that went unaddressed that maybe should have been. So again, please share your thoughts. Please comment. We love talking about it, love hearing about it, love hearing what you guys think about maybe some of the young guys that, again, we don't know about as the average college football fan, but might be able to really step up and shine, be a depth piece that, again, I don't know about necessarily, but they'll make me find out. So, yeah, thank you for rocking with us. We really do appreciate it. We'll see you later.